fifth round, and John Deverill is going to pose a question to Mr. Deans.
This is a triple-barreled effort. The free trade debate is a decade behind us. Should the big trade agreements be reversed? Can there be an independent and democratic Canada? Do we need stronger international institutions, and can those institutions in any way be democratic?
So to answer the first part of the question, the Natural Law Party is in favor of free trade because free trade is natural to the expansion of happiness and natural to the expansion of progress. However, the Natural Law Party is not in favor of international agreements which in any way compromise the sovereignty of sovereign nations. For example, we would not be in favor of having the Canadian dollar taken over by the American dollar, because then we would lose control of our own fiscal policies. We feel that the way to ensure international cooperation is to realize that all of the outside influences that are damaging Canada today are coming because of incoherence in our collective consciousness. As a physicist, I can speak of the Meissner effect, where a magnetic field can penetrate a metal unless the electrons in the metal are highly coherent. Then you have a superconductor, and that repels the outside influence. So the way to ensure the sovereignty of Canada in the future is to create a group of yogic flyers, experts in creating coherence in collective consciousness, and then we'll be able to have the good effects from outside without the damaging ones.
And now for the Communist Party, Miguel Figueroa.
Well, in fact, you know, the Free Trade Agreement of '88 and then the NAFTA treaty, which took its place in '93, both of these treaties have nothing to do with free trade. In fact, their essence is to ensure the mobility for international capital. They don't guarantee the mobility for working people. Mostly, they don't even involve the movement of commodities. Most of the commodities that are moved around the world or between various countries are firm movements of goods. Basically, these treaties not only undermine the interests of working people and set countries and peoples against one another, but also undermine the sovereignty of our country and of other countries around the world. That's why we see a growing movement amongst not only working people, but environmentalists, women's organizations, indigenous organizations, anti-poverty groups and so on, against these treaties. Why there was such a mobilization against the multilateral agreement on investments of a few years ago, and why we saw the events in Seattle just last November and literally around the world. There is a growing, as I said earlier, divide between the interests of these trade, corporate-run trade agreements and the people.
Thank you. For the Green Party, Dr. Joan Russo.
The Green Party is calling for the abrogation of NAFTA and the dismantling of the WTO. But at the same time, we're calling for the implementation of what I've referred to as the public trust international law. What we will find in Canada is successive governments have always said we have obligations and commitments under free trade agreements, but you don't hear them say we have obligations and commitments under human rights agreements, peace agreements, labor agreements, and environmental agreements. This is what needs to be implemented internationally. And you were saying, is there a possibility of having a body that could function democratically? The United Nations Assembly, to a certain extent, always seems to tip the balance in favor of what I would refer to as the public trust. But what we need is to move away from the Security Council, which I've often said is an affirmative action program for nuclear powers. And what we should do is to try to bring more respect for the International Court of Justice. And in fact, I'm very much against the new proposal for the FTAA. And in fact, I was in Quebec yesterday. I went to where they're going to be emptying a jail to jail the protesters. I took a picture. I refused to give the camera, and they locked me up in a cage for 45 minutes. This is serious. I guess I was the first protester to be incarcerated.
Thank you very much. Paul Hellyer, you almost have a proprietary interest in this question.
Almost. There is a clause in both the Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA called the National Treatment Clause. This is really a license for foreign corporations to first substitute corporate rule for democracy, and secondly, to colonize the world apart from the 5 major powers. And in Canada's case, first colonization, and then due to our unique geographical position vis-a-vis the United States, ultimately annexation. we have to get rid of the National Treatment Clause. And if we don't, we're going to wind up as the 51st state. Now, the government almost entrenched that clause a year or so ago under the Multilateral Agreement on Investment. We won that battle, but we haven't won the war. Joan referred to the FTAA, which is the next. They're going to entrench it there. We have about 2 years to reverse the course of history. If we don't do it within the next 2 years, it's goodbye Canada. So we have to act quickly and reverse the course of history if we want to keep Canada independent.
Mr. St. Maurice, free trade, globalization, and marijuana.
Yes, absolutely. It's hard to talk about free trade in the world or in Canada when Canada doesn't even have a domestic trade for the marijuana industry. I think that once that's established and there is a legitimate industry, then we can look into trading with other nations that would have a legitimate marijuana industry. The marijuana prohibition, this problem transcends municipal, provincial, and federal jurisdiction. This is a global problem. I mean, I've traveled to 24 countries and marijuana is illegal in all of them. It did not stop the fact that it was quite present in all of these cultures. So I think perhaps marijuana is a banner that will help unite the world, strangely enough. And globalization is an inevitable phenomenon. Well, with communications, technology, the world is shrinking. I think it's important that we act now and start thinking of a democratic access to the global democracy. And I think that Canada, by moving on the marijuana issue, could be a shining light to the rest of the world as to what a sensible drug policy is, and this would influence the U.S., and the rest of the world will be behind Canada. I am quite certain of that if we move on the marijuana issue.
Thank you very much. You almost spoilt the record. Just a few seconds over. The sixth question, the sixth round, Mr. Figueroa of the Communist Party will lead off, and Greg Vezina is posing the question.
I think you missed me out on the trade one.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sandra. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, not to repeat some of the points that have been made, but to raise another aspect, which I think is extremely important, is that, as was mentioned before, there's nothing free about this trade. And far from it, trade wars are escalating, they're becoming sharper, and we know, and we have the experience of 2 world wars, that trade wars lead to hot wars, and the situation is very serious. One of the problems is the dictate that comes that all countries have to have free market economies, what is called human rights, which is nothing to do with human rights, that any country that, and this multi-party system of government. I think that besides, we're making a lot of advances. The situation is very dangerous in the world. The situation of the third world countries is extremely serious. And besides the people's movements, such as Seattle, Washington, Prague, and all of this, Windsor as well, we also have the elections which took place in the United States, which the whole world is laughing at, that this is a banana republic. Who are they to dictate to us? So the people will be carry on making headway to affirm their rights all over the world.
Sandra Smith, my apologies for missing
Not
you
at
that
all.
time.